One of the things that can be tricky when working with truth functional argument forms is actually recognizing an argument form when we're presented with it. And that's because sometimes the way that arguments are presented to us, whether it's in ordinary language or symbolic representation, those arguments don't look identical visually to our representations of those argument forms. Let me show you what I mean. So here's an argument. You're either going to not eat a tofu burger or an alligator hot dog. It's not the case that you're not going to eat a tofu burger, therefore you're not going to eat an alligator hot dog. Now, this argument's kind of tricky to make sense of because there's all these nots in it, all these appearances of the word not. So what we're going to do is we're going to represent this argument symbolically and look at it and look to see if we can figure out what's going on in it. So we're going to use the letter T to represent the statement, you're going to eat a tofu burger, and A, you're going to eat an alligator hot dog, and we're going to represent the individual statements of this argument. So you're either going to not eat a tofu burger or not eat an alligator hot dog. That means tilde T or tilde A. Second premise says this. It's confusing. It's not the case that you're not going to eat a tofu burger. That calls for the dreaded double tilde. And our conclusion says you're not going to eat an alligator hot dog. Okay? Now, when we look at the representation of the disjunctive syllogism form, it doesn't look anything like this, okay? We've got a first premise in the form that has no tildes, and our first premise has tildes. And the second premise here in the form has a tilde, and we've got the double tilde here in our argument, and Q doesn't have any tilde on it, okay? So it doesn't visually look like the form, but what we really want to focus on is what is this argument doing? How are the premise statements interacting with one another? Well, the first premise is giving us two possibilities. You're either not going to eat that tofu burger or you're not going to eat that alligator hot dog. And now look what the second premise does. It's not the case that it's not the case that you're going to eat that tofu burger. Okay? It's not the case that you're not going to eat that tofu burger is what that double tilde says. Well, that just took away the possibility that I was not going to eat it. Because now you're telling me that it's not the case that I'm not going to eat it. Well, if it's not the case that I'm not going to eat it, then it must be the case that I'm not going to eat the alligator hot dog. And that's exactly what the conclusion asserts, okay? So what the second premise is doing here is it's taking tilde T away from us. It's saying, I gave you tilde T as one possibility in the first premise, and in the second premise, I'm taking that possibility away by saying tilde T. Okay, now, this is a valid disjunctive syllogism. It actually does comply to this form of disjunctive syllogism. It just doesn't look like it. One thing to take note of is that tilde T is the equivalent of T, okay? So tilde T says it's not the case that not T. In other words, T, all right? So another way we could have represented this argument is by using just T as our second premise. And again, it doesn't look like the form that we're familiar with, but it's doing the same thing as the form. If T is true, as the second premise asserts here, tilde T has to be false. And if tilde T is false in the first premise, tilde A has to be true, and that's exactly what the conclusion says. All right, now let's take a look at this argument. You're either going to not eat a tofu burger or an alligator hot dog. It's not the case that you're going to eat a tofu burger, therefore you're going to eat an alligator hot dog. And when we symbolically represent this argument, we get something along these lines, where we have, you're either not going to eat a tofu burger or you're not going to eat an alligator hot dog. You're not going to eat that tofu burger. So what it says? Yeah. Therefore, you're going to eat that alligator hot dog. And again, it doesn't seem to comply with our form here, but what's important is how it doesn't comply. It visually doesn't resemble our representation of the form. It's that it doesn't do what the form of a disjunctive syllogism does. It doesn't take away one of the possibilities offered in the disjunctive statement. Instead, it simply asserts it. And remember, when we're using inclusive disjunction, it's called inclusive because it includes the possibility that both sides of the wedge statement can be true statements. It includes that possibility. So in that case, simply asserting that one of the possibilities is true doesn't allow us to draw any conclusions about the other possibility offered in the disjunctive statement. So in this case, we have an attempted disjunctive syllogism, but it's not doing what the disjunctive syllogism form does, and it's therefore invalid.